like you're creating a lot of false dualisms here, because, like for one thing, you're using the idea of concept and object, and a lot of people do argue like that, but not everyone argues like that. But particularly the part where you talk about, metaphysical statements can't be false. But there's a lot more logic out there than simply bivalent logic. Like, for instance, modal logic is talking about possibilities and all that stuff.
And all that.
And like, there's so much more in logic. Like, there's logic that has like true, false, and indeterminate. There's logic that talks about like absurdities versus non-absurdities. There's all sorts. And so to say that something is absolutely meaningless.
Well, that's why I made it absolutely clear. That's why I tried to make it clear that this only works with assertive statements. Now, assertive statements are, when you talk about empirical ones, either true or false, based on what you can see in the world. Only when you're asserting something, though. If I say, Cassie, I love somebody. Like, I love Cassie. Or if I say something like a joke, if I give a little quip, that's not true or false either. Now, it might be nonsense, but it's not an assertive statement, so that doesn't actually count. Now, so when it comes to something like that, certainly other types of logic can deal with different sorts of things. At the same time, when you're making an assertive statement, you have certain rules that you follow, as both, say, propositional predicate logic have shown us. And there's a reason, and also on the concept and object thing, the reason why that dualism exists and it's so confusing is because Frege, as he points out, I only use these in the logical sense, not the psychological sense. And that's also confusing. But what he's basically saying is that this is a linguistic rule, that which is predicated cannot be a predicate, and that which predicates cannot be a predicate. Oh, sorry, that which is a predicate cannot be the object. Yes?
I feel like a lot of philosophers would respond to your ideas by saying that even using your logic, if you take it far enough, every word is meaningless, right? It's our way of conceptualizing things in the world that we need to communicate somehow. And if you take that idea logically far enough, you arrive at pragmatism, where everything's meaningless, but if everything is meaningless, it's also meaningful, and because you can't really make a difference between those two, and we might as well just stick with what is the most useful. And I mean, you used various forms of the verb to be like hundreds of times.
Yes.
So.
And that's where we distinguish ordinary usage from non-ordinary usage. The ordinary use of the word is how we use it. In other words, how people, when they're interacting in general, in a public way, create the meaning of the word. I use the verb to be all the time because that's how it's used in the world. Whereas, if you continue along those lines, when have you ever walked up to somebody and said, well, what's the determinate being of your character? They're going to look at you like you're insane. That doesn't have that same sort of public meaning.
So you mean like within like the isolated context of like a language game of people who all agree on the meaning of the philosophical meaning of the word being?
Certainly, yes. Like within the language game of philosophers,
okay.
That would be
so
what
like
being means.
That's like what you're
Yeah. I'm talking about within like a certain context, like people who use being philosophically.
Okay. Like logical analysts,
yes.
Philosophers.
This might not be something you're able to speak to, and that's fine. But I was just wondering, non-English language philosophy. So in particular, there are languages around the world that don't have a verb to be. And the idea of being as a nominative or as a participle or whatever just doesn't crop up. And I guess I'm wondering, did you do any thinking at all about how these sort of linguistic nooks and crannies and loopholes work in a language other than English?
I did a bit, and the one thing I did conclude on, because as you mentioned, being doesn't exactly crop up in those languages, from what I did find is that the copula only exists in Indo-European languages. So within one language family in the world, that concept actually appears.
Okay.
And it's a minor part of that too. So you get to a different language, you don't have the same sort of concept. So that would actually be something to explore if I spoke those languages.
Sure.
Any objections or things to throw at me?
We have a couple minutes. Maybe I'll just ask you to. Sorry, if there was someone
I
else,
was
please.
curious. You mentioned Wittgenstein at the beginning. Was this early Wittgenstein or late Wittgenstein?
It's both.
Okay.
The first part about ordinary usage, things like that, that's late Wittgenstein.
Mhm.
The parts about the propositions being, empirical versus metaphysical,
Mhm.
that's early Wittgenstein with the stipulation that he later pointed out that this only works within a certain aspect of language.
Mhm.
It certainly works, but it only works in a tiny aspect of indicative statements.
I see. Because I was asking because I don't know terribly much about Wittgenstein, but I know that when you do talk about him, it's very important to couch,
Right,
that because his early statements are so often contradicted by his later statements.
Right, and actually, an interesting thing would be Elizabeth Anscombe, one of his literary executors, the person who he considered to be his real heir, not really real heir, but the one he trusted the most to understand his ideas, says that there is no real clear cut there.
Mhm.
There's Wittgenstein who says these things in the Tractatus, and there's later Wittgenstein who says, and that's good, just doesn't work fully, that I'm going to fix that later now. I'm going to make it all work. And so the real break belief comes from other interpreters who weren't that close to him. And oddly enough, that became popular.
Mhm.
So. No, you said you had a question?
Yeah. So I'll try to be brief. So I wondered whether you could clarify a little exactly what the target of your paper is. So there are places where it looks like the target is a philosophical use of the word being. So for instance, worries that you shouldn't have a theory of language according to which all words are names.
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't think that nominalizing a verb is going to actually refer to something the way that the name Steve refers to something.
Mhm.
And there it looks like the target is a word. There are other places where it looks like the target is what the philosopher wants to mean by the word being. So like there's some sort of concept of being that the philosopher thinks they can deploy, but for one reason or another, they can't. And it seemed to me those are two different views that you could be attacking. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about.
Well, my target was the entire concept itself, the entire philosophical usage of the word, of trying to make an argument about the concept, of any use whatsoever. Thus, both of those are targets of mine that you mentioned. And I actually anticipated that sort of feeling because it is a very broad-based paper. I have a three-pronged attack as opposed to a one-pronged. The paper is much longer, much more detailed, and you get a better sense of that. It's just with limited time to speak. It sort of ends up seeming as if I'm attacking multiple different targets with ships passing in the dark. So I apologize for that feeling just because with time constraints.
Any other questions? If not, then I think we should thank our speaker.